I'm sure we've all seen this warning message in the past. Please note that WinRAR is not free software. After a 40-day trial period, you must either buy a license or remove it from your computer. But the funny part is that even after the 40-day trial period expires, nothing happens. WinRAR doesn't block you from using the program, nor do they force you to uninstall the software. In fact, you can just close this window and continue using WinRAR as if you paid for it. You don't have to keep downloading new trial versions of WinRAR or find a cracked version of the software. But I'm sure all of y'all already knew that because this is precisely what everyone does. This isn't some sort of glitch either. The company behind WinRAR is well aware of the situation, and they actively allow users to easily bypass their paywall. It's also not like WinRAR runs any ads or sells your data, so they truly don't make any money from users who refuse to buy a license. Considering this, why was this virtually free software created, who actually ends up paying, and how does WinRAR even make money? Well, starting off with the history of WinRAR, WinRAR is by no means a new piece of software. WinRAR was launched way back on April 22, 1995 by two brothers named Eugene and Alexander Roschel. Eugene was the brains behind the operation and took care of all the coding behind WinRAR. Meanwhile, Alexander worked on the marketing and distribution of the software. By trade, Eugene was a software engineer, so he was well aware of all the strengths and weaknesses of early computers, and one of their biggest weaknesses was limited storage. The obvious solution for most people was to simply buy more storage when they ran out, but Eugene felt that there was a better solution. What if you could have the same data take up less space? This wasn't a new idea by any means, but Eugene had a special twist on the idea. You see, the vast majority of data compression software that was available in the 1980s was lossy-based compression. As the name suggests, this means that part of the data is lost during compression. For example, if you were compressing a 4K image, you could substantially reduce the size of the file by having its resolution. But this is obviously not the best solution. Eugene's goal was to create a lossless data compression algorithm, and this led him to creating the RAR file format. But wait a minute, how does lossless data compression even work? How can you store the same data within a smaller space without losing any data? Well, the key is to leverage natural redundancies within the data itself. For example, let's take a piece of text. If you wanted to save this quote onto your computer, the most rudimentary method would be to go letter by letter. You could tell the computer that the first character is I, and the second character is T, and the third character is a space, and so on and so forth. But a far more efficient method would be to tell the computer that the character in the 1st, 17th, 23rd, 31st, and 34th positions are all the letter I. Now of course, that's an extremely basic form of data compression, but that's the overall premise. The idea is to eliminate redundant data storage as much as possible by using algorithms, machine learning, partial matching, etc. Anyway, after grinding for quite some time, Eugene came up with a new file format called RAR in 1993. And 2 years later, he would release a piece of software that could compress data into and out of the RAR file format, and this marked the birth of WinRAR. Given that the software was free to try, it didn't take long for WinRAR to gain popularity within the computer market. After all, most users were desperate for storage. This isn't nearly as relatable nowadays, given that we have loads of storage. Not to mention, external storage options as well as cloud storage options are both cheaper than ever. And this is one of the main reasons that the popularity of WinRAR has been on a massive decline over the past decade. But back in the day, computers had extremely limited storage, so you had to be super careful with what you stored. Anyway, Eugene continuously launched newer versions of WinRAR that implemented the latest data compression technology, and over time, RAR along with zip became the standard for file compression. Alright, so now that we discussed the history of WinRAR, let's take a look at the paid version of WinRAR. More specifically, let's look at what exactly the paid version offers over the free version. By far the biggest benefit that you get from paying for WinRAR is that you don't have to close the buy page window every time you open WinRAR, but that's pretty much it. You're basically paying $29 to remove this pesky window and of course be on the right side of the moral compass. This may not sound like a big perk at first glance, but if you use WinRAR on a regular basis, you'll spend hours closing these pesky windows throughout your entire lifetime. A fellow YouTuber named RMD Tech actually has a full breakdown on how much time you can save by purchasing the license and why it's well worth the investment. Jokes aside though, no one gives a crap about having to close this window. Not to mention, there are plenty of easy ways to get rid of this window without paying. Not that I recommend that, of course. But realistically, the entire program is basically free for everyday people. This might sound like a stupid business move, but there's actually multiple legitimate reasons behind this, starting with popularity. It is possible to make software secure enough to deter the vast majority of pirates. I mean, just take a look at macOS. Yes, it is possible to install macOS on a Windows machine, but actually getting through all of the kernel errors and driver issues takes well over 10 hours, and most people just don't care enough to go through that. The thing to note, however, is that this does not mean that the user is just not going to use a computer at all. Chances are, they're just going to pirate a piece of software that's easier to pirate. Within the OS space, this was Windows, and this is one of the main reasons that Windows is so popular. If Windows wasn't easy to pirate, it's very possible that the dominant OS would have been Linux. But since Windows was easy, most people just stopped right there. This same rule applies to WinRAR as well. If it was hard to pirate WinRAR, people would have likely just used zip instead, or maybe some other file format would have risen to the top. So offering WinRAR for free to the public was basically an investment for the company to get the public on their side. Once they have the public on their side, they've basically already won, because companies will have to follow suit. Now, of course, there's gonna be some oddball companies out there that force customers to use some obscure file format, but the vast majority will just adopt what the public is already used to. This doesn't just apply to customers either. Employees are also part of the public. And if WinRAR is what employees are most familiar with, that's what companies are most likely gonna use. This is the key reason that software like Microsoft Office and Adobe's Creative Suite are so common amongst companies and schools. If you get the public on your side, institutions will follow. And unlike the public, the institutions will actually pay. As an everyday person, there's really no reason to pay for WinRAR unless you simply want to support the developers, and if that's you, that's great. But at the same time, you don't really risk anything by not paying. This is not the same case with companies though. Sure, it wouldn't be that hard for companies to just pirate like everyone else, but this is simply not worth the consequences. And I'm not talking about legal consequences. Sure, WinRAR could sue them and they'll have to go through the hassle of a lawsuit, but that's not the biggest concern. The biggest concern is the reputational risk you're taking by pirating software, and that's simply not worth it, especially given how cheap WinRAR is. If you're buying licenses for over 1,000 employees, you only have to pay a measly $6 per license. If it gets leaked, however, that your company has been using pirated software, you'll be paying a far greater price. For example, let's say Apple needs to use WinRAR for whatever reason. Apple currently has about 150,000 employees, and let's say 10,000 of these employees need access to WinRAR. At $6 per license, that's a lifetime cost of $60,000. Now, let's say Apple tried to avoid this cost and pirated WinRAR, and that this eventually got leaked. Surely, there will be people who will no longer be willing to shop at Apple because they don't want to support a megacap that's actively screwing over a small business. Out of the 100 million phones Apple sells every year, even if only 100 customers made this choice, Apple would lose out on $80,000 worth of revenue and $800 per phone. Now, what if 1,000 customers decide to stop shopping at Apple? Then we're looking at an $800,000 revenue hit. At 10,000 customers, we're looking at an $8 million revenue hit. Keep in mind that 10,000 phones is just 0.01% of Apple's annual volume. So even if pirating WinRAR only pissed off 0.01% of just their iPhone customer base, Apple would be missing out on millions of dollars worth of revenue. And we're not even considering recurring revenue from these customers. This issue gets exponentially worse if we're talking about a software company. For example, what if it got leaked that Adobe or Microsoft wasn't paying for WinRAR? In this scenario, the company that's trying to sell you software isn't paying for software themselves. What better pass do customers need to just pirate the company's software? At this point, even customers who would generally pay for the software would consider pirating it. Clearly, this would not be a very favorable outcome, and it's more than enough motivation for companies to simply pay for all their software. In the end, WinRAR was basically the godfather of the freemium business model. Just get users on your side and then figure out monetization later. When they first leveraged this model in the 1990s, it was quite a bold move. But today, many of the businesses that we come across on a daily basis use this same model. I mean, when was the last time that you paid for Instagram or Facebook or Google or Snapchat? None of these companies have a pop-up window that tells you that the service is not free and that you have to pay for it. But at the core, they all make money in similar manners. Once they have you on their side, they offer some sort of service to companies, and it's the companies that pay for you. Nowadays, this model has actually become so popular that it's unique if you don't leverage it. For example, the selling point of some newer search engines and social media platforms is that they don't collect your data. They're either decentralized nonprofit organizations or they directly charge customers for their use. YouTube Premium is a perfect example of this. It doesn't look like WinRAR is trying to hop onto this new trend though. They've become iconic for their 40-day trial period that's actually infinite, and I don't think they're looking to change that. Also, based on Google Trends, it looks like WinRAR is on its way out, as the demand for file compression amongst everyday people is slowly dying off. According to this website, they still pull in $21 million worth of revenue, and given that they run an extremely lean operation, they're likely still profiting millions per year. So, while they probably won't become the next Adobe, it looks like they've got a solid business that works for them, and that won't be changing anytime soon. Do you guys still use WinRAR? Comment that down below. Also, drop a like if you're still trying out WinRAR. And of course, consider checking out our Discord community to suggest future video ideas, and consider subscribing to see more questions logically answered. But until then, I'm Hari, and I'll see you guys on the next one.